Hello, I'm Meg Russell from the Constitution Unit at University College London, and I've been asked to talk to you about who's in charge of the Westminster Parliament. This is a complicated question which can only be partially answered in a brief talk, but I'll do my best from a largely political perspective. There are three ways in which we might interpret this question. The most obvious is who decides policy in the Westminster Parliament. I'll mostly talk about that, but there are other angles as well. Notably, who controls what Parliament discusses and who controls who gets to sit in Parliament in the first place. Starting with policy, there's a common conception that Parliament's a rubber stamp, simply agreeing what's put in front of it by government. If that were true, it would mean our famous parliamentary sovereignty was really just executive sovereignty. And it often looks true from the outside. For example, nearly all bills Parliament passes are government bills. Even the amendments Parliament makes to those bills are overwhelmingly proposed by ministers. Government is rarely defeated in the House of Commons, and defeats in the Lords can potentially be overturned by the Commons. But this impression uses an oversimplified notion of how power in a legislature works. Control isn't all about confrontation and defeat. Because the government's accountable to Parliament, it's rational that it should take Parliament's views into account before policy is introduced and during its passage through Parliament. This pattern of anticipated reactions is widely recognised by legislative studies scholars, and there are numerous mechanisms through which it operates. First, the government and its backbenchers are drawn from the same political party. This means they often share the same ideas and coexist harmoniously. But there are numerous back channels within the party to help maintain that harmony. In formulating policy, ministers will think carefully about the likely reaction in the parliamentary party and consult behind the scenes. They'll be reluctant to put something forward that the party doesn't support and may trim proposals if concerns are expressed, helping explain all those government amendments. They also listen to others beyond the party, for example, the views of expert parliamentary committees, key crossbenchers in the House of Lords, and even the opposition. All of these groups have the potential to make noise, to cause embarrassment, and mobilise external pressure groups and the media, all of whom are watching parliamentary proceedings closely. The very public nature of Parliament means there are numerous opportunities for embarrassment if government gets things wrong, what I in my work have called the power of exposure. This applies in the legislative process, but also other forums in Parliament with no obvious teeth. Within government, a huge amount of time goes into preparing, for example, for things like parliamentary questions and committee appearances. The government wants to avoid public embarrassment and keep the peace with Parliament, and particularly with its own backbenchers, because in the end, the government only is the government due to having the House of Commons support. Indeed, the government sometimes takes up matters specifically because they're demanded by Parliament. You could say one major example of this was the Brexit referendum, which David Cameron clearly didn't want to hold, but came under sustained pressure from his backbenchers, even at threat of being removed as leader. He's open about this in his memoir, saying, "I make no apology for paying close attention to the views of Conservative MPs. That is how our political system works. A Prime Minister serves while he or she retains the confidence of Parliament. In a parliamentary democracy, the leader of a parliamentary group has to pay attention to the views of that group, and that group, Cameron says, was pressing for a referendum." So accountability to Parliament frames everything that government does. This context is so fundamental that it's often invisible, leaving the impression that Parliament's a rubber stamp. So if the parliamentary majority takes the same view as the government, you can't automatically assume who's controlling whom. This invisibility does lead to problems and misunderstandings, however. External commentators often characterise Parliament as a rubber stamp, and some political leaders themselves fall for this Westminster myth. When he was Deputy Prime Minister, Nick Clegg, having complained from opposition how powerless Parliament was, got a bit of a shock when Conservative MPs killed off his Lords reform proposals, which was a surprising miscalculation given that Labour MPs had done the same to Tony Blair. Theresa May, I think, had also fallen for the executive power myth. to the extent that even when confronted with leading a minority government, she somehow believed MPs would fall in behind her Brexit proposals. In his book about May, Anthony Selden reports comments from her chief whip, Julian Smith, that when he warned her that her deal was facing catastrophic defeat in the Commons because so many Conservative MPs opposed it, he was, in his words, regarded as a serious irritant by the Prime Minister's team, who responded, "This is the deal. Your job is to deliver the votes on it." But that's just not the way it works. The job of the whips is as much to communicate MPs' views upwards as it is to communicate the leader's proposals down. Having ignored this fact, May, of course, came a cropper. All of this became remarkably nasty over Brexit, with a toxic mixture of an uncontrollable governing party that was completely split, a minority government, and a referendum mandate to deliver. These were extraordinary times, which led to numerous misunderstandings, and the risk is that they, perhaps combined with COVID, have resulted in a reset. This began under May with her anti-parliamentary rhetoric when she faced problems with her deal, and the government, notwithstanding being a minority government, using its control over the Commons agenda in ways that frustrated MPs from all sides of the argument and greatly worsened the tensions. While the government may not be able to get its way on policy, it does have significant control over what the Commons gets to discuss and decide, to an extent that I've argued is problematic. We saw this both over Brexit and over COVID. May's successor, Boris Johnson, has gone on to test the system close to destruction. He also buys the executive power myth, and even more stubbornly than Theresa May, insists on pressing ahead even when the circumstances suggest a need to heed your critics and compromise. By doing that, rather than the subtle balance that usually applies, you're daring the critics to play hardball too. But as Prime Minister, you do hold some significant powers, not just over the parliamentary agenda, but even over who gets to sit. Notwithstanding the fact that Johnson himself had voted against Theresa May's Brexit deal twice, he immediately ejected 21 Conservative MPs from holding the whip for casting a single rebellious vote against his government. They included some very senior figures, most of whom had voted for May's deal even when Johnson hadn't. Those who'd lost the whip were then denied the chance to stand in the 2019 general election. That's not normally the way the game works. Notably, Jeremy Corbyn, the then leader of the opposition, had voted against Tony Blair's government over 400 times without facing serious sanctions, and then went on to be elected leader. So this is just one of the many examples of Boris Johnson not submitting to the usual norms. He fought that general election on a manifesto which, as we all know, pledged to get Brexit done. But it also denounced, and I quote, "the failure of government to deliver Brexit, the way so many MPs have devoted themselves to thwarting the democratic decision of the British people in the 2016 referendum." This was again only one of many examples of authority figures actively undermining the reputation of key institutions, particularly Parliament and the courts. And of course, Boris Johnson himself had arguably been part of the thwarting. Back then, competing claims of sovereignty were thrown around in all directions. Both May and Johnson's governments effectively demanded that Parliament get out of the way because they had a direct mandate from the people, so that parliamentary sovereignty should be disregarded when held up against popular sovereignty. But that popular sovereignty became a reason for asserting executive sovereignty, a mood which hasn't really since gone away. But if it was that simple, the Brexit row wouldn't have occurred, because if May's government was simply implementing the will of the people, there was no need for Johnson and his allies to use Parliament to undermine her. Instead, it was about competing visions of Brexit within the Conservative Party, with a sizable slice of personal ambition thrown in. Since winning his majority, Johnson's more justified in thinking that Parliament will do what the executive wants. I'd say that overlooks the usual complexities, but I think he actually wants to overlook them. he continues to test the system to its limits. And the extent to which he can get away with all this essentially depends on his MPs. Of course, the government doesn't enjoy a majority in the House of Lords, and the dynamics there can be quite different. All recent governments have suffered significant numbers of Lords' defeats, and the normal pattern has been for the government to listen and be prepared to compromise where peers note genuine flaws in legislation. This both minimises the number of defeats and makes for better policy. Even when defeats occur, the government's tended to give in some of the time, particularly when members of its party in the Commons have sympathy for the points the Lords is making. But again, boundaries are being pushed here. In the past, I've analysed the trajectory of Lords' defeats in detail, and I haven't updated that detailed analysis recently. But my anecdotal impression is that the Johnson government just wants to face down the Lords. The most obvious case was on the Internal Market Bill, where a huge defeat in the Lords was inflicted on the government over the proposed breach of international law, which the government demanded that its MPs overturn. Again, they were the final arbiters, and despite some obvious discomfort, they went ahead and did so. This last week over the Northern Ireland Protocol, there's been talk of introducing numerous new Conservative peers if the Lords dares to continue defeating the government. Again, the Prime Minister does have an almost unfettered power to do this, another kind of power to control who sits in Parliament, which is highly problematic in my view. The only real constraint is norms about appropriate behaviour, and if the Prime Minister simply chooses to ignore those, there's little comeback. Ultimately, this relies on public opinion and again on the views of MPs. And those can be headed off if the government and its media supporters seek to demonise the Lords as an enemy of the people or an enemy of Brexit, again undermining the reputation of our institutions. So to summarise, the normal circumstances are that Parliament has a great deal more influence over government than most people think. That's exercised to a significant extent through fear of embarrassment and the government's fears of upsetting its own backbenchers. But if you don't care much about embarrassment, and if your backbenchers put up with your bad behaviour, and if there's no public backlash, the typical constraints will have little effect. How long Boris Johnson can get away with that is an interesting question. This all rests on public opinion and ultimately on what Conservative MPs are prepared to bear. Because in terms of who controls whom, returning to the topic of this talk, more than any other group, they are the ones in charge. And for the moment, although many feel shut out, they largely seem prepared to back their election-winning leader. Thank you.